Hello, I'm Thomas Moore. I want to thank Harriet Ziegler and Cheryl Holmes for inviting me to participate in your conference in this way. The first thing I want to tell you is something you know too well, that the world is changing quite radically and quickly. Things are not the same as they used to be at all. I think we don't take this change into consideration enough because the deep changes, the things that change us as people, are going on every day, one step at a time, and we're changing even though we're not aware of it. In other words, it's a gradual, unconscious transformation of what it means to be a human being, and even how we see the world. And these changes have had a striking effect on religion and on the spiritual life. Today, it's very common for people to feel that the old traditions that used to sustain them are no longer alive for them. This obviously is not true of everybody, but there are significant numbers of people who feel this way. And personally, I have a great deal of empathy for these people who are the seekers or those who have rejected religion. They have good reason for having rejected religion. In the past, it treated people in an infantile manner, and it offered very, very simple definitions and rules for what are mysteries that a person can never fully understand or come to grips with. So I think we need a new kind of religion, a new way of being in the world. We have to go with this change that is happening and let it have its impact on us. When I think this way, I'm reminded of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who in 1944, in the letters he wrote from prison, discussed this issue. I'd like to read a passage from one of those letters that he wrote. This is from July 16th, 1944. The world that has come of age is more godless, and perhaps for that very reason, nearer to God than the world before its coming of age. Jesus calls people not to a new religion, but to life. That's quite a challenge, I think. The world that has come of age is more godless, and perhaps for that very reason, nearer to God. What an interesting paradox that Bonhoeffer got a hold of so long ago. So the world that has come of age and appears to be godless might be more godly in a way than the old world where everyone seemed to understand and know what was going on spiritually. Today we are seeking, many of us anyway, are looking. We are wondering. Our minds are more open than they used to be. Or we are rejecting, and that's a form also of taking life seriously. So I think that in this world that is changing radically, that has a lot of dangers in it, that we have to grow up spiritually. We have to be adults and not children. I thought that we were changing, and I know we are in many respects. But I'll tell you a little anecdote, something that happened to me not too long ago. I was asked to write a piece for a Catholic publication. And I have to tell you, I am very, very devoted to my Catholic background. And I still consider myself a Catholic in a very deep way, even if the church may not quite understand my own form of Catholicism. Anyway, I was asked to write something, and I wrote what I thought was a fine piece. And I got it back from the editor saying that he wanted me to take out all sexual references because they might hurt or offend or disturb the readers. I felt I was back in the 1950s. That we are going to offend readers today, and the way I would include some sexual references in my work, I thought they were very beautiful connecting the spiritual life with our deep sexuality. But I used real language. And he found this offensive. So I thought to myself after this little experience that maybe we aren't changing as quickly as I thought. Maybe there is this very large sea of people hanging on to the old way of being religious, not hearing Bonhoeffer's idea that we as a world are coming of age, and we need a spirituality that is adequate to us, that is up to our current standards. You know, even those of us who are learning how to operate smartphones and the most recent computers and watches and all these things, cameras, that is a kind of intelligence. It's not just technical. It has to do with becoming more able, taking things into our own hands, of being in a world that is more complex and adjusting to it by learning more things that we have to need to keep up. Well, why don't we do the same thing with our spirituality? We really need to do this. It was this feeling that led me about 7 years ago to return to my Christian roots. And I wrote a book on Jesus, which presented Jesus very much the way Bonhoeffer hints at in this little quote I read to you. That Jesus wants to bring us not to a religion, but to life. And so I wrote about Jesus in this manner. And then when I went around to present the book to the public, many people asked me for a good translation of the Gospels. And even though there are some really fine ones around, at least the English is very good and they're fairly up to date, I don't know of any that reimagine some of the key terms the way I would want to do it. So I sat down and made my own translation of the Gospels. The first volume of that translation is just out this week. The book of Matthew has just come out. I'm only telling you this because I think this is one way to be religious in a godless world, where there is a great deal of evil, where the demonic is let loose in horrible ways, where we are still very barbaric. I think one way to do this is to go back to our tradition and become more intelligent about it and revise it, revision it, use our imaginations to bring it up to date in this very complicated world. It's by making religion outmoded and archaic sounding and archaic in substance that takes the spiritual right out of our culture. We become more and more secular. That is not to our benefit. So it's your job, I think, and my job, to be intelligent about our approach to the spiritual life. So if we're going to give spiritual care to people, we have to prepare ourselves by becoming religious in a way that is equal to our times. Another way of putting that is, even though your work may be outgoing, you may be doing service for many people, you have to pay attention to your inner life. Your inner life, your development as a person who is contemplative and even, I would say, mystical, is important for that work. So this is one thing I would really encourage you to do. Read the mystics of your tradition or of other traditions. Read the Sufi mystics. Read the great Christian mystics. Read the Jewish mystics. And discover how you can be more mystical. And if you are out there working in the trenches, trying to serve people, you need that mysticism more than ever because you need that basis. You need to be able to be a person of such substance and big enough as a person to be able to really be of service to people so that they can draw from you as you present yourself to them. So that's one thing, to prepare for ourselves as mystics. And that leads me to one of the primary ways that everybody understands, primary ways to a deeper spiritual life, and that is the natural world. Nature is always there, not as only as a physical resource to exploit or to use, but also as a spiritual resource. As I speak to you, I'm in my home, which is by a small lake and next to a relatively small mountain. The mountain and the water are very important spiritual resources for me and for the people around me. Not long ago, the people of our town gathered to talk about the spirituality of our region, and I was surprised as one person after another stood up and talked about how important the mountain was for their spirituality. I really thought they'd be talking about what they learned in church, but they talked about the mountain as the focus of their spiritual life. Every particular aspect of the natural world can help us in this way. I'd like to read to you something on this topic from one of the great spiritual teachers in the United States in the 19th century. I live in New England here, and Henry David Thoreau lived not too far away and used to climb this mountain that I was talking about. So, in his journals, he wrote about his experiences and his thoughts about the spiritual life. Let me read a couple of things to you. Here he says, this is written in 1851. He says, "The art of spending a day, if it is possible that we may be addressed, it behooves us to be attentive." And what does he mean? To be addressed. To be addressed by the mysterious presence in nature. To be addressed by the voices that you hear as when you are in nature. To feel the presence of nature in all of its many aspects. By watching all day and all night, I may detect some trace of the ineffable. It's wonderful. By watching, being watchful all day and all night, I may detect some trace of the ineffable. That's a good way to move toward becoming more mystical. Let me add one more line from this passage. My profession is to be always on the alert to find God in nature, to know his lurking places, to attend all the oratorios, the operas in nature. Let me go over that. My profession is to be always on the alert to find God in nature, to know his lurking places. So, it seems to me that it's very important that we rediscover the importance of the natural world. I know where you live. This is very important because you are close, even if you're in the city, close to nature. And nature is very dramatic. And you have so many variations of nature speak to you. I love the way the Greeks used to talk about this. They said that a place, like a natural place, like let's say a pond or a stream, had its nymph, its spirit, its residing spirit. I wish we could recover that sense again. So there we are. There's one way to become more spiritual. It's fairly obvious, but we can reimagine that for ourselves and for the people we serve today as well. And again, if you are doing this work for people and giving service as part of your profession, you need the spiritual input of the natural world and other resources. Another way in which we come of age today, spiritually, is that we no longer make such a big distinction between the sacred and the secular. This is an aspect of the spiritual life that has been very important to me, actually all my life. There's something deep inside me, I think I was born with it, that loves to connect the ordinary world and ordinary life with the sacred and the spiritual. But I've studied this a great deal over the years. And one of the things I discovered in my studies was how much we can get from what we call secular literature, like secular poets, secular novelists, even some movies, and certainly from the visual arts and music, and the other arts, dance, architecture, all of them. We can gain a great deal from from the arts that we consider secular, but have a great deal of spiritual insight in them. One of the best examples I have, again, is from one of my neighbors of the 19th century, Emily Dickinson. Let me give you a very short poem that she wrote that I think expresses what I'm trying to tell you. Here's her very little poem. In the name of the bee, and of the butterfly, and of the breeze, amen. Let me say it once more. In the name of the bee, and of the butterfly, and of the breeze, amen. I could talk to you for a long time about that poem, but just a couple of things let me point out. One is, of course, that she takes this formula, this prayer, and turns it into a prayer within or for nature. So we have a bee, we have a butterfly, and we have a breeze, very simple things. 3 B's that are the basis of her natural spirituality. She called herself a pagan at times, even though she went to a Christian church, with some regularity at a certain point in her life. These words also could be taken more deeply. For example, in the name of the bee, that bee could be being, be, to be alive, to be a person, to be me. In the name of the bee, in the name of my being, in the name of the butterfly. The butterfly is another aspect of nature that's beautiful, delicate. We could talk about the butterfly for a long time, each of us, I'm sure, and have some sense of the qualities of the spiritual life that we could find through that little element in nature. And of course, there's this further notion that Jung talks about, that the Greeks used the same word for butterfly and for soul, psyche. So the third element there was, and of the breeze. Now the breeze is a small wind, and the wind is a traditional image for Holy Spirit, which is the original in that little formulaic prayer. So there we have a very profound poem that is not presented by a spiritual teacher as such. It's not a Sufi poem. It's not a Christian poem. It's a poem of the spirituality of the world in which we live. It is both secular and sacred at the same time. And there's another aspect in it that I think is significant. And that is that there's an element of almost humor in it, of wit, of irreverence, you might say. And I think Emily is a good example, Emily Dickinson, is a good example for us to not take our spiritual life in a heavy way. She's always doing it with a great deal of wit and charm and fun even. Now there's a good lesson for us, to bring more fun to our spirituality, more wit, not make it so heavy. Instead of being moralistic all the time, judging people, judging ourselves, instead of doing that, we could be lighter, be happy, live a joyful life. Don't have so much weight. Religion of the past has wanted to put a weight of guilt on us. We don't need that. Let me give an example of that. Just recently, I went out to dinner with my daughter and her husband. We walked into the restaurant. I guess I got there by myself early. I walked into the restaurant. There was a man sitting at the bar that I knew. He's a nice fellow who works for us, does some work on our house, carpenter and contractor. I was happy to see him because he's a nice fellow. I walked up to him. He was in conversation with somebody, and I just broke in for a minute to say hello. And I said, "Hi, really happy to see you." And he went immediately into all kinds of guilt, trying to give excuses why he hadn't done this or that for our house and why he had made promises and hadn't done them. Those thoughts were not even on my mind at all, not at all. I was happy to see this man. But the guilt was there. And this is what happens to us. We can become guilty in our spirituality, and it ruins our worldly life. It puts a big bar between our spirituality and our ordinary living. There's almost nothing that is more destructive than that. So again, I recommend to you in doing your work that you love ordinary life. You come to love it. It's not different from, it's not separate from, and it's certainly not the enemy to the spiritual life. You can find beauty and inspiration and even holiness and sacredness by going to an art museum, by going out into nature, by walking down your street, by going into a good market. The Greeks and others who had a polytheistic religion understood this universal sacredness. They had a god or a spirit for everything, including the market, the stores. Imagine that if we actually thought we could find God in our supermarkets. So this is a challenge, I think, for us at this time in our spiritual lives. We are challenged to find the holy and the sacred everywhere. Not to separate these two worlds and only focus on one and neglecting the other. If our ordinary life has been secularized, then in my language, it doesn't have a soul. It doesn't serve our humanity. It becomes cold and objective and mechanical. That's certainly not the life that we want to live. Now that brings up another topic that I'd love to mention just in passing to you. Our spiritual life requires not only the upward movement into the high realms of spirit, it also requires a basis in the deep soul. Soul and spirit need to be together. In my work, I make a big distinction between soul and spirit. So spirit is that element in us which is so important and so valuable that takes us out into the future. Imagine the cosmos, the world in which we live, how we should live, how it all works, leads us to prayer, to meditation, to all of these things that take us beyond ourselves, that allow us to transcend the small worlds in which we live. That spiritual realm is so important. But the spirit that takes us to these places and into the future, quickly, spirit-like speed, also has a counterpart in the deep soul. And when I wrote a book like Care of the Soul, this is what I was trying to do. I was trying to restore a sense of a soul, not to say anything contrary to the spirit, because the spirit is so important, but to add this ingredient that is often missing, which gives us our humanity and our individuality, the deep soul, and allows us to connect to each other in a deep way from the heart. Our usual sense of the image of the heart is an equivalent of soul. So to live from the heart is to be a soulful person. Now, what is the soul like? The soul likes things of the past. It likes memory. Memory is very important. Telling the stories of our lives, telling our histories, our cultural histories, keeping old buildings, keeping our old literature alive. All of this reference to the past and to memory is important to the soul. Attachment is important to the soul, not detachment. Detachment is important at times for the spirit. It helps our spiritual life to be detached in many ways. But it helps the life of our deep soul to remain attached, to be attached to our homes and to our pets and to our region, to the things that we have and that we own, attached to our friends so that it's difficult to go away. That's a very good soul feeling. If a person can easily move away and not feel their attachment to their friends, then they must be weak in soul. I understand that sometimes we do have to choose a spiritual life, our spiritual values, and for a while at least, and to some extent, deny the soul what it wants. You have to do that at times. These things, it's like a dance between spirit and soul, and one has to allow for the other as you go through life. I think in your work this is particularly important because sometimes people who do your work burn out. They burn out rather quickly. And I think burnout is always a sign of the absence of soul, not exactly a loss of soul, but a diminishment of soul. So I would recommend to you that you do these things that are important for your soul. Keep your friendships alive. Have parties. Get people to have lunch with people. Do all these things that give those important nourishments to your soul. That can be extremely important. Okay, I could go on that subject forever, but our time is coming to an end, and I would like to now mention one theme that I think is very important to the spiritual life. I'd like to end with it. And that is the theme of emptiness. To me, it's the beginning and end of the spiritual life. Empty means not being, I was going to say attached. You have to be attached for the soul, but emptiness is being able to really enjoy and appreciate and use something like, let's say, a spiritual teaching or method, but to do it lightly, so that it itself has a certain emptiness in it. It's not so solid that it just kills you and it's a huge weight on you. Its emptiness gives it the possibility of your use when you want it, when you can use your own free will and your own judgment. So emptiness to me is very important. I want to tell you a little story, an emptiness story. There are many, many stories about emptiness in the traditions. Here's one from the Sufis. The Sufis tell a lot of stories about a teacher called Nasruddin, who lived in a small village and had many adventures, and they're usually quite funny, and yet they are important teaching stories. So in this story, very simple story, Nasruddin is in his village, and an old friend of his comes to him and says, Nasruddin, I'm going away for a long while, and I'm not going to be here all this time. I'm going to miss you. And I was thinking about that ring that you wear on your finger, that beautiful ring. If you were to give me that ring and I put it on my finger, and when I'm away, every time I looked at that finger, I'd think of you. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, if you know anything about Nasruddin, you know that he loves his possessions. Even though he's a spiritual teacher, he loves his possessions. He's a very soulful spiritual teacher. And so he says, I'll tell you what. He said, I have a better idea. So why don't I keep my ring? And then, when you are away, whenever you look at your finger and you see that it's empty, that there's no ring there, you'll think of me. That's a beautiful, I think, beautiful little teaching story about emptiness. I often think of that when I need a lesson in emptiness, that I look at my finger. In fact, sometimes I actually look at my finger. And I look at a finger that doesn't have a ring on it. And I think to myself, that no ring, that nothingness on my finger is my teaching for the day. This is the way I have to live, as though there is nothing that I have to believe in, nothing I have to do, nothing that I am so attached to that I can't go on with my life without it. I need that kind of emptiness in my life, especially in my spiritual life. Now imagine if you were to live this way, if this was your spirituality, that you could be lighter with it, that you wouldn't have everything at stake in it. This is not to say it's not important, but that you can take it lightly. You don't have to be a heavy person in presenting your spirituality to others or carrying it for yourself. And you see the emptiness, the wisdom of the emptiness. You don't take everything literally. In fact, you take nothing literally. You see everything as poetic. The poetic mind is a kind of empty mind because you look at something and you see that it represents something else in itself, what it is in itself is not as important as what it points to. It's empty. That's another lesson it would take a long time to really talk about, but I wanted to bring it up with you before we finish our conversation today. So there's one more thing that I would like to give you before we finish. And that is, if I can find it, yes, here it is. And that is, I would like to finish with a little prayer. Now, those people who know me know that I have a great love of Ireland and Scotland, England. I love the Celtic traditions. I'd like to read to you just at the end the Rune of St. Patrick. A prayer that I think really says a lot about what I've been trying to say to you today. A prayer that you could recite over and over again and keep in mind the importance of the natural world for our spirituality. At Tara today, in this fateful hour, I place all heaven with its power, and the sun with its brightness, and the snow with its whiteness, and fire with all the strength it hath, and lightning with its rapid wrath, and the winds with their swiftness along the path, and the sea with its deepness, and the rocks with their steepness, and the earth with its darkness. All these I place by God's almighty help and grace between myself and the powers of darkness. I wish I could be with you today, but at least I can be with you in spirit and in image. I wish you great success with your conference, and especially with the work that you do as you go on. Please remember to put soul in everything you do. Spirit without soul is lonely. Your spirituality needs your deep soul. Your great spiritual hopes and purposes require the pleasures of your home and your friends, the pleasures of your soul.